Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CTN Web Seminar Series. I am Tracy Williams, CTN Training Coordinator and moderator for today's session. The theme of the day is informed consent. So I would like to welcome two representatives from the Office of Human Research Protections. We have Dr. Yvonne Lau, who is the Director of the Division of Education and Development at OHRP. And also we have Ms. Misty Anderson, who serves as a Senior Advisor for Public Health Education at the DED as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Misty to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tracy, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to be focusing today on informed consent, as you know, and we're going to, instead of doing a broad overview of informed consent, we are going to kind of look at a more tailored presentation of some of the points in the regulations that are going to be most relevant to substance use disorder research. So hopefully you'll find this very helpful to the work that you do on a regular basis. Our normal disclaimer here, if Yvonne and I are prone to giving our opinions about different things to answer questions, if there's not a straight up regulatory answer, so please understand that if we give you our opinion, it is simply our personal opinion and not that of HHS. And with that, let's go ahead and dig into the important content here. So why is informed consent so important? We obviously focus on it quite a bit in the regulations and well beyond the regulations as well. Now, this all comes down to the purpose of informed consent. And what is that purpose? Well, it is to help people make their own informed decisions about whether or not to participate in research, and about our job to support them in making those informed decisions, which usually looks like giving them that information that they need. So this comes out of a couple of different ethical ideas, the first of which is autonomy, that notion that individuals can make decisions for themselves in their everyday life about anything based on their own values and opinions, and that this applies to research participation as well, that their decision to join a study or not join a study should be based on their own values, the way they choose to live their life, their own sense of the good, and that is their autonomy. So we call these autonomous decisions. Really important to supporting individuals giving their or making their own decisions is that it be completely voluntary. We say this really quickly all the time about research. Well, it should be voluntary. Of course it's voluntary, but really stressing that that is the underpinning here. It needs to be a voluntary decision. And we'll come back to that quite a bit today. And this comes out in the regulations, of course, in the requirements for informed consent, which have been revised recently. Hopefully you're all aware. And that's what we're going to really focus on today. Now, the second piece of this is that not everyone has full functioning autonomy all of the time. And if we're going to be inviting people to participate in research, we need to acknowledge that and recognize when it is the case. Because if someone does not have full autonomy to make their own decision, then a number of ethical reasonings say that those people should be protected. And in fact, the regulations implement this as well, that there are requirements for additional protections for anyone who might not have full autonomy in making their own decision. Within the regulations, the real focus on this is whether there's a possibility for undue influence or coercion in the informed consent process. This is something that we'll spend some time talking about today, about what these look like, what they mean, and what they look like in different situations, and how we as researchers and IRB reviewers and people who administer research can think about it in order to appropriately protect our research subjects, and which additional protections we need to employ in this research, what kind of expectation there is according to the regulations, and above the regulations, what other things should we think about that may not be spelled out in the regulations. So specifically to substance use disorders, autonomy we can look at it a little bit differently. So the main question I want to start with is, can one's autonomy be impaired when they're dealing with a substance use disorder? I would suggest that there are times when this might be the case. And one of the things about autonomy is it can be situational, right? This isn't a matter of you either are an autonomous, full-grown adult, or you are not. There are stages and there are gray areas here, and so it really requires some different thinking. So, for example, perhaps you have someone that has just entered into a treatment program. And they are coming in, they are dealing with an active addiction. Perhaps they are dealing with their first experience with withdrawal. And you think about all the things someone might be going through there, and would they be in the best place to make a decision to join a research study that might have some level of risk for them? They may not, depending on how severe this is and what they're actually experiencing during that time. They may not have full autonomy to make a clear decision based on their own best interests. And so that is something to think about. If a particular research study involves recruiting individuals that might be in that span of experience and time, then this is something to think about, and whether additional protections might be a good idea. So when we think about different ways that we can protect people and their abilities to make their own decisions, and then if they decide to be in research beyond that point, the first thing we can really think about, and that's built into the regulations, and that's the biggest given, is that for those with full autonomy, we protect them by empowering them to make their own decision. And that means giving them the information that they need to make that decision. And of course, informed consent has been required for a very, very long time by the regulations. The fact that it's required is not new, but the way that is now required to be given, that has changed. And that's what we're going to dig into a little bit today. It's kind of the revisions to the regulations focus on not just giving information, but how you give that information and making sure it's understandable. And then, of course, recognizing when additional protections might be necessary, which is very context specific, depending on the study, on the population that you plan to recruit for the study, and how you're going to go about doing all of this. And this is what's not necessarily laid out point for point in the regulations. So we will spend some time referring to this today as we go through, because there's some nuance here. And based on your expertise, you will be the best ones to think about this and evaluate it for individual research studies as you go along. So let's talk for just a second about coercion and undue influence. Separate them out. The regulations say them together just like this all the time, and I think a lot of people do because it's easy to kind of lump them together. There is a slight difference here, whereas coercion generally is a kind of a threat that something bad might happen, or that you might not get a certain benefit. So, for example, if someone is undergoing substance abuse treatment, and coercion might come in the form that they might be very worried about, say, legal repercussions related to their substance use, and so they might think that if they join the study, that that would be lessened somehow. It would be seen as doing something helpful, and it might offer them more protection. So for prisoners in particular, so we can talk about prisoners, and with the regulations, I want to point out that prisoners are not just people that are incarcerated or are in jail. By the regulations, the definition of prisoner includes people who might be living in a residential treatment facility when that was part of an agreement, right, from a legal proceeding. So instead of, say, going to jail, they are going to this treatment program. If they are there involuntarily, then by the regulations, they're considered to be a prisoner. And what that means is that there are particular protections that the regulations require. These are part of subpart C, which you may be very familiar with already. And in this example, we have to think really carefully about coercion, right? There are stipulations in there, for example, that you can't promise a prisoner that say that you will inform their parole board that they participated in this study and do things that might influence, what might happen down the line. Things like that. Undue influence, of course, is different than coercion in that it's not a threat. It is the promise of something that might make it hard to refuse. So, like, the easiest example is offering, a monetary compensation for joining a study and making it an exorbitant amount. Right, that's probably the easiest way to think about it. And ways that you can counteract that is if you want to offer some sort of compensation for joining a study, you could think about how you might offer that. Perhaps for some populations, it would be better to give in the form of gift cards than in cash money or things like that. But it's your job as a researcher to think about what, is a reasonable compensation versus what is an undue influence, what is too much. And that would really make it hard for someone to say no, even if they didn't want to join a study. So when you're thinking about a particular research study, what the most important thing for you to do here is to think about what's the context of the study and what are the circumstances that would adhere to the participants. The recruiting group that you want to pull from, what is the situation that they're in? Because when the research is designed, you will have this in mind. And so you need to think about these things when you start thinking about, okay, then how do we protect our populations here? Be aware if your recruiting pool includes marginalized populations, especially if they have historical distrust of research or researchers, and if they feel vulnerable in that position. We encourage transparency as much as possible as a way to engender trust. And as you earn their trust, of course, then you have a responsibility to maintain it and follow through on that transparency. So the question becomes, how do you make sure that prospective participants or their legally authorized representatives have a fair chance at actually getting and understanding the information that you're going to give them, and so the information that they need to make a decision about whether to join a study? It's not just getting the information. It's not just you giving them the information. It's making it so that they can understand the information. And that really is the crux of what we're going to start talking about as we move through here. So informed consent, as we said, has been required for a very long time. The revisions to the common rule that have now been in place for 2 years really focus on making it meaningful. A lot of the improvements around the requirements to informed consent focus on this point, not just giving information, but making it meaningful. So the focus in the general description of informed consent is the idea that you need to give the information that a reasonable person would want to have in order to make an informed decision about participation. So a reasonable person, we're not going to dig into this too much, but the way to really think about this is your recruiting pool, right? Think about the group that you want to recruit. Think about the context here, the situation that they're in, who this group is, and try to think about what information they are going to want to have so that they can make this decision. And then it's a matter of how do you provide this information. And the regulations now require that the information is presented in sufficient detail and is organized and presented in a way to facilitate understanding of why the person might or might not want to participate. So these are a couple of new standards that have been implemented in the revised rule that change the way that we think about informed consent and why we give this information, and really tries to get everyone to think about what the real goal of informed consent is. So I find it helpful to think about this as, all right, what if it were me? If someone were asking me to join this study, what information would I need to decide if this is what I really want to do, if this is the best thing for me to do, or this aligns with my values? If you can put yourself in the shoes of someone in your recruiting pool, think about what is going to be important to them. So these are 4 aspects that we feel are extremely important: the context, the content, the presentation, and the language. These all go together to form the space in which the information that you give is understandable and therefore can support an individual in making an autonomous decision about joining your research, or if it, in this case, is, if it happens to be a legally authorized representative, give that person the information they need to decide for someone else. So some example of what might this mean for substance use disorder research? Well, it's understanding, so depending on what you're studying in your research, it's understanding that certain groups in the population might be disproportionately affected by a particular addiction to some sort of substance, right? And understanding about that group, who they are, where they're coming from, and being able to communicate to them the information that they might need. In addition, understanding for your recruiting pool for this particular research, where they are in, if they're in an addiction, where they are in that. Are you recruiting when they are dealing with an active addiction right now? Or are you recruiting from a group of people who are in recovery and perhaps have been in recovery for 10 or more years? You would approach those 2 groups differently. And you would think about protecting those 2 groups a little bit differently. And also thinking about the intersection, if we're talking about a treatment program, right? Treating people with a substance use disorder, there's an intersection in many cases of treatment programs and legal decisions. So whether they're in treatment programs voluntarily or involuntarily, or whether they might be worried about potential legal repercussions if anyone were to find out, or things like that. But understanding that that intersection is of particular relevance for some of these recruitment pools and for groups of people, and being sensitive to that and considering that information when you're talking to them about research and trying to recruit them. All right, this, digging in a little bit here, we're going to talk about those 4 things that I mentioned, and we're going to start with context. And Yvonne, who you're going to hear from shortly, found this cartoon, and I just love it. It's my new favorite thing, because they've got all these great little scientists that have found this neat thing, and they're each looking at a different place, right? One is saying, hey, it's a fan, it's a wall, no, it's a rope, no, it's a tree, it's a snake, it's a spear. And none of them are standing back far enough to get the big picture, which is, of course, to say, this is an elephant, right? And in science, of course, this is legitimately true, because to study something, you have to dig in and be fairly focused. But I think it's a great cartoon because it really does illustrate the fact that the context is important, and we have to, as researchers, think a little more broadly about the study before we dig into the study. And again, we're going to try to turn and take the perspective of the potential subject here, or the potential participant, remembering that decisions about one's health are particularly complex, right? Because there are decisions that they have to make about their own health and well-being and care and repercussions of those decisions. There's nothing easy about this, and usually it involves taking in a lot of information about what a treatment might look like, what's the intervention, is it a drug, is it a behavioral intervention, what might it mean, are there side effects? There's a lot to think about. These are complex decisions for individuals, even when you're just talking about healthcare, let alone when you start bringing research into it and the uncertainty that comes with research. Add to that we're talking about substance use treatment on top of a normal health issue, and the impact may go beyond just health, right? If someone is dealing with a substance use disorder, they're probably fairly concerned about their privacy and confidentiality because of repercussions that could follow if the information were not maintained confidential, right? They might be worried about embarrassment, they might be worried about legal problems, they might be worried about employability, or how it might impact their family members. There are many, many things that someone might be worried about, and that makes the decision even more complex for them. And then you're going to invite them to be in a research project. And it's important for us all to remember that most people who aren't in the world of research are not nearly as familiar with even the simple concepts of research as we are. And since we spend all of our working hours in this space, it's easy to forget that even the simple concepts here are new to a lot of other people. And so you have these complex decisions, and then you add new information about research and uncertainty on top of that. And so that context is usually the space that we're in when we're recruiting subjects. And so it's important to take all of that into account as we create our informed consent materials, both the information, say the form, and think about how we will present that and how we will explain it in order to support their understanding so that they can make a decision about whether or not to join the study. Now, how are we going to give this information? Well, I would encourage you, again, to think about it from the perspective of the recipients, of the people you are recruiting. They're going to have questions. And so sometimes it helps to actually lay them out in questions and to not just say, you know, we kind of out of training, we say, well, the purpose of the study is to find out blah, 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 blah. But there's a little more to it than that. And people might have questions like, why do you need to study this intervention? Why can't you just do it? Just do it and see if it works. Why is it that you need to study this in some kind of formal way? And what are you looking for? If you think it might work, why can't you just give it to people? Why do you have to go through this research process? Why do we have to consider, you know, being in a randomized study where some people get it and some don't? Why can't you just give it to us? And these are really valid questions that people need to understand if they're going to join a study, because it speaks to why we have uncertainty in research, and that's helpful information for them to have. What are the risks, right? What is it that you're worried about? Because if the researchers are worried about it, then the potential participants should probably know about it, right? They should know about those risks. And they should know about it, again, in ways that they can really understand it. And risks in particular, pausing on this for a second, I think it's really important to organize this information in a way that's helpful, right? To use words that they'll understand, not technical medical terms, and not just a long list of these are all the things that could go wrong, right? But separating them, you know, these are the things that might be likely. These are things that are a lot less likely, but they would be potentially, you know, harmful to your health or whatever the case may be. Think about giving this information with headings or descriptive subheadings. You know, it is helpful sometimes to make questions your headings, but depending on what information you're giving, you might do it in another way. But again, thinking about not just giving a piece of paper that's all text, right? No walls of text here, because none of us like being faced with a wall of text, but making it accessible, easy to see, and so that they can find the information that they want. And you know, and here's another piece of simple information. You know, why are you asking me to participate? Okay, sometimes this might be perhaps obvious, right? If you have someone that is seeking treatment for a substance use problem, then they may not be surprised when you ask them to join research about a certain treatment. So it may be obvious, but it may not. But explaining why they might be interested in joining this study. Language itself is really important. The words that we use are important, and sometimes we are all a little guilty of using vague words because there's uncertainty here. But I would suggest to you that there is importance in giving the most specific information that we can and being honest about the uncertainty. That's the point of research anyhow. So if you have a study that is going to look at an interventional drug, for example, it's probably not enough to just say, we're trying to find out if this drug is effective. Well, what does effective mean? Do you mean it's going to cure me of my addiction? Or do you mean it is going to make me feel better right now, or it's going to lessen my cravings? What exactly do you mean by effective? So again, you say what you know. So perhaps, you can say something more specific, like, well, we want to find out if this drug might decrease the chances of relapse over time. And if you have information about why it might do that, you can give that. But again, the thing to watch out for is that you don't fall into complex jargon to explain why it might be the case. So there's a bit of a line here that you have to walk about giving specific information, but giving it in language that is understandable. Think plain language. And then important terms, right? So it's not just about technical language, but it's about the words that really describe the research. So randomization, of course, is a classic example of this. When someone joins a randomized study, we have to explain what randomization means. And, and this is a super common analogy here, right? Randomization means that you'll be assigned randomly, like the flip of a coin, right? Which is a great analogy. It describes it perfectly. You even get an idea of the chances. Everyone's familiar with this. But notice that all this really tells you is how the randomization will happen, right? And that's it. It only tells you how. What we're not saying here that I'd like to suggest is important to say is what randomization means to them. If they join this study, what will it mean to be randomized to a group? And there's a lot of information you can give here that's important for them to have. For example, you cannot choose the group you are in, right? Now that sounds like a statement of the obvious, but we need to be really, really clear so there's no misunderstanding, right? So if you're joining a randomized study, you will not be able to choose the group that you are placed in. The assignment is random. It is not done because this particular group is better for you. That's a really common point that is sometimes misunderstood. So flat out saying it, you'll be put in a group based on a random decision, not because anyone thought that it was the better group for you to be in. And that means that if you join the study, you need to be okay with either option, right? Or any of the study groups. Understanding that since it's random, there's a chance you could be placed in any of the study groups. You need to be okay with that understanding and knowing that that's the way that it will be. So if you have a strong preference for one of the study groups or another, the one that gets the intervention or the one that does not get the intervention, then you might not want to join this study. If you have very strong feelings about what you want to happen for your treatment, this study may not be for you. And saying that outright in a very understandable and clear way can really help people make this decision. And as you're giving them all of this information, it's important to think about giving them enough of it. And I'm not saying here that we want to make these super, super long, but it's important to really think about what information do they need. So informed consent kind of traditionally, right, the complaint that we've heard for years about informed consent, other than it being really, really long, right, is that it just gives all this random information. And I would say that in recent history, most informed consents really only focus on the intervention. In this case, in this example that you see right now on this slide, we have a test drug. So this is a drug intervention. And so most informed consents have focused on giving information about that test drug and then talk about, well, the two groups, some will get the drug and some won't. Everybody gets usual care, but some would get the drug and some would get placebo. And what I would say to you is that that's not complete. This is the decision point where they are. What you see in the purple circle here, when you're talking to people during the informed consent process, you're giving them information about joining the research. The decision that they have to make is up here. So it steps before the randomization happens. Their decision is to join the study or to decline to participate in the study. And so what you really need to give them is information that will help them make that decision, not just understand what happens after you decide to join, right? But we're acknowledging that this is where they are right now. And so you really want to provide information about their options. Right now you're making this decision. You can join the study, in which case there will be this random assignment, and then you can explain all of that. Or another option is you don't participate in this study. And if you choose not to participate in the study, these are the things that might happen. You'll still get your usual care. You can talk with your doctor about other treatment options, right, that we can't provide in this study. And you can look into other research studies with other options. But giving them the two full scenarios empowers them to make this decision for themselves. Right? And remember, this is about empowering them to make their decision. Then once, if you have someone that's, of course, deciding to be in the research, then you can get into, well, what does it mean to be assigned to one group or the other, right? So you can explain that this is a randomized study, so you will either get this test drug or you'll get a placebo. So it can be really helpful in a case like this when there's, in this case, just two study groups. So you get a 50-50 chance in a randomized study to put them side by side and compare and help people think about in a comparing way what this might mean. So in this case, if you get randomized to the group that gets the test drug, right, you've got a 50-50 chance of being put in this group. You'll receive usual care and you'll receive the test drug. You won't know that it's the test drug. You just know that you get something to take. We do not know whether the test drug will actually help treat your, in this case, opioid use disorder. I'm just using that as an example here. If it is effective, which is what we're studying, it may reduce your cravings for the substances, it may help manage your withdrawal, and it may help you stay off of opioids in the future. These are the things that we're trying to find out. These are the possible benefits. If it is not effective, then you will not get any of those benefits. And it's possible that it could worsen your disorder. And then you might get, you of course would want to give some information on side effects. These are what the side effects might include. You may experience these side effects even if the test drug isn't effective, right? So that's all important information to give. And on the flip side in blue here, you lay out the information for if you get randomized to the placebo group, right? You'll receive your usual care and the placebo, but you will not know that it is the placebo. You'll just know that you have something to take. You'll receive no medical benefit from the placebo. And you will not benefit from or be harmed by the test drug since you won't be taking it. The placebo will not make your disorder worse, and you will not benefit or be harmed by the test drug since you won't be taking it. Since it does not contain any drug and it is an inactive compound, there will be you will have no side effects or treatment effects from this drug. So putting them side by side can help make it very clear for the listener or the reader, the participant you're recruiting, to understand the difference between the two groups. If I join this study, I will fall into one of these two groups, and this is what I'll be looking at. Am I okay with being placed in either one of those groups? If I'm not okay, if I have a strong preference, then this might not be the thing for me, which leads me to the next point. Providing for them to make it very, very clear, and again, support their understanding, some possible reasons why they might want to join the study or might not want to join the study. So this can help them recognize and find themselves in these reasons. So you can provide these in different ways. I find that it's helpful to give them first-person statements to see if they can recognize their own thoughts and feelings in there. So for example, this will not be a complete list, by the way, but these are just some for examples. I want to help advance science. I can help researchers figure out if this test drug can help people with an opioid use disorder or with whatever disorder you're studying. I want to try this test drug. I think it might help me. Other things haven't helped me, and I'd like to try this. And the only way I can try this is by joining this study. The study description said it included blood tests for HIV and hepatitis, and that counseling will be provided if I test positive. I'd like to know my test results, and this is a benefit, right? So some people, that would be a reason that they might want to join a study. Reasons that one might not want to join the study, and it's equally important to point these out to potential participants. I don't want any uncertainties. I want to know what my treatment's going to be, and I want to follow it, and I do not want any uncertainties. I don't want an unproven treatment. You're testing this because you don't know if it works better, and I can't handle that right now. I need to have something that I know that works. So I do not want to join this study. Or, I'm worried that if I that if I participate in this, my name will be linked to this study and someone could find out about my drug use history. That's too big of a risk for me and I'm not willing to do it. Or falling back on the same point as last time, I don't want to be tested for HIV or hepatitis, and that's part of the study. And since I don't want that test, I don't want to join this study. So you can imagine for different studies, these points would look different, but these are things that are going to be important to people. So you look at your study and you look at what's offered and what will be important to them potentially in making their decisions. And sure, it'll be a little different from person to person, but when you know what the study offers and what the uncertainties are, you can point out, you can identify the things that are most likely to be important to people who are even considering being in the study. And try to think a little more broadly, right? What are the questions people might ask that would be kind of the highly relevant questions for this study? For example, if I join this study, could I still join another study on a different intervention, right? Maybe something else comes along. Would I be able to do that, or would I not if I join this first study? Or if I join this study and you learn something important about this drug that you're testing, good or bad, what will happen? Will you tell us in the middle of the study? What would happen if you learn something bad about it or something dangerous? What would happen if you learn something really good about it? Would anything change? Would you tell us? Or what happens if I join the study and while I'm participating, I have a relapse or my disorder gets worse? Will you help me? What does that mean for my study participation? What are the consequences of that? These are pretty reasonable questions for people that might be considering joining a study. And if you can kind of predict what these questions might be, you can provide this information up front. Again, increasing that transparency, building that trust with your recruitment pool, with your potential study participants to bring them in and share this information so they can make their decision. Okay, now with that, I'm going to pause for a minute here. I'm going to invite my colleague Yvonne to then start sharing and take over for the next section. It's all yours, Yvonne.
All right. So hello, everybody. So I just want to say that, informed consent is obviously something that the Office for Human Research Protections talk about all the time. And I just want to say that, as scientists, we spend a lot of time, and rightly so, thinking about how we would design a study to find out, certain things that we want to find out, how we can actually design the study really well so that we could get the results we want. And often when we do studies that involve human participants, it's really just as important, if you think about it, to spend as much time thinking about how we can actually be able to get subjects into the study, but in a way that, they really respect them. And I think that, in today's world, as we see all the movements towards fighting for equitability, social justice, it's really bring it up front to us that, thinking about people and being respectful of people and really treating them as, an important part of our endeavor, right? After all, if you don't, it's not just, not getting enough subjects, you don't get the results that you want, the valid scientific results that you want. But also, the importance of having people supported and continue to have trust in the scientific enterprise, in the research enterprise. It's a really important thing. And I think that all of you have come to, just as many of us have come to realize that in the last few months, we see how trust can be really fragile. And it's something that we could lose very, very easily. So I think that paying more attention to how we think about getting consent from people and giving them the information they need for them to make a decision that they really feel, values them as a person. It's really important. So Misty has given you some of, has talked about some of the new requirements in the revised common rule. And I hope that, in her presentation, you were able to realize, how much the new requirements to many people seem like, oh, it's the same old, you're talking about the same thing. But I think to me, they are quite different. I think that they really try to put a focus once and for all on, the person, the potential participants, really trying to use the regulations in a way that the regulations can be used, right? We can't make regulations to be too restrictive and too prescriptive. And therefore, it makes it hard sometimes for people to understand the meaning of the regulations. And I hope that, with Missy's presentation, how she's tried to tease out some of the, steps that we could take to make informed consent more understandable, it's something that's useful to all of you. Now, before I continue with this presentation, I also want to just say a few words about how privileged Misty and I are, in being invited to give a presentation on informed consent to the NIDA researchers. And I, the reason why I say that is, as we were preparing for this presentation, I was just thinking about the kind of research that you guys do. And just before this presentation earlier this morning, Missy and myself, we were having this conversation. And, I have a background as a medical doctor, as a surgeon. I went into medicine not just because of the science, but also because of the human side of things, very much so, because, as you might not know, I subsequently actually stopped practicing surgery, but went on to study bioethics. And you can see how I find that to be fascinating. And I think that as NIDA researchers, I think you all are, amazing. And for me, I'm very envious of your role, because you don't get to just study the science of addictive substances, but you get to be faced with a whole spectrum of human conditions, right? Your studies tend to generate, ethical situations and concerns that really require a lot of creativity. And not just that, but also empathy to juggle, right? With the situations properly. So, it's really hard for us to, through a 75 minutes presentation, to be able to cover, all the different aspects that you guys actually face in your research. So, here in this second part of this presentation, we're just going to pull out a few things in the common rule, a few requirements, few provisions in the common rule that may be of particular relevance to you. All right, so for the next part of this presentation, I'm going to focus on one of the general requirements in informed consent that you find in 46.116, the part about sorting informed consent under circumstances that provide sufficient opportunity to discuss and consider whether the person would like to participate, and that would minimize the possibility of coercion and undue influence. And then the other part about requiring to provide a statement about how confidentiality will be protected and maintained. I'd also like to talk a little bit about, the provision for IRB waiver and alteration of consent, because I think that some of your questions that were submitted ahead of time related to this particular provision. And then the third one is also in response to a question that we received from you all. So we can talk a little bit about the waiver of documentation of consent. So voluntariness, right? Informed consent must be sought under circumstances that provide sufficient opportunity to discuss and consider whether to participate, and that minimize the possibility of coercion and undue influence. So I think that, in order to think about that, you really need to consider the circumstances, right? This year's already talked about how important context is. So circumstances related to your subjects. So when, consent is being sought, are your subjects likely to be under the influence of certain substances? Does that even matter? Does that, automatically mean that if they were under certain, under influence of certain substances, that would automatically render them totally incompetent to make any kind of decisions, right? It's a situation I kind of think about is not unlike, in past when we would talk about people with some dementia or mental incapacity. that, it's not an all or nothing, right? It's not an all or nothing situation. And knowing what kind of substance you are studying and what kind of substance that those people, your potential subjects might be under, could help you understand, okay, well, what are we talking about here? The details are really important. The other thing is, do your subjects have a co-occurring condition? And I think that this is a very, very common situation in the kind of research that you all do, right? I went on your website and I looked at, substances, and I find that, you have a good list of, co-occurring conditions that you deal with almost like, I wouldn't say day in, day out, but commonly, right? One of that could be a person having a co-occurring mental health condition, so co-occurring medical conditions that could also affect their capacity to make consent. How would that influence where and when your consent is being obtained? It could also be, not medical conditions, simply a situation of their status, right? Their physical status. Did they just come out of, prison? Were they involved in some sort of legal actions? And that, now they've just been released? What were their circumstances like? Are you dealing with prospective subject populations that have a lot of mistrust? Mistrust for institutions, mistrust for research participation, right? And I dare to say that mistrust is likely to be a fairly common shared experience in the kind of prospective research subjects that you all would have, to face with. So at the end of the day, I think that having a real understanding of the subject populations for your research and being very sensitive, and if you like, even empathetic to what they go through, it's really extremely important in how you think about, I'm going to use the word designing your study, right? Often when we use those terms, we're talking about, how the study is set up from the scientific perspective. But as, I think that, you all could recognize that how important it is that is not just from the scientific side, but also the design from the perspective of recruiting and providing information, being able to successfully bring on subjects in a respectful manner, how important that would be. So by knowing your subject population, you can start to address some of their concerns in a more proactive manner, right? Think about what goes through their minds when you are telling them about your research study, right? You might be giving them a list of information, but at the back of their mind, they might be thinking between the lines, okay, well, they're going to ask me to do this, or they're going to ask me to, to go to this place, right? In the back of their mind, they may be, well, is that, am I going to, will people notice that by going there, that I would become stigmatized, right? I mean, okay, if you are, recruiting subjects from a methadone treatment center, then maybe there's less of an issue because, your subjects are already going to the methadone treatment center. They're already having to go there to receive their treatment. And if you're recruiting subjects from that treatment center for, some sort of, substance abuse related study, then perhaps there's not that much, additional stigmatization that might come about. But I realize that, substance abuse, is not necessarily a problem. Or rather, it's not an uncommon problem affecting people who might be, who might appear perfectly, healthy and working in a perfectly, legitimate situation, context, right? I mean, recently, I was listening to NPR and I heard that, substance abuse could be a real problem in healthcare environment, affecting many healthcare workers, right? So these are people who work in a legitimate situation, who under most circumstances would be considered like they have a fairly good position. They work in a center that nobody would imagine that problematic things might happen, but it turns out that many of them are so stressed out and that they have easy access to substances that could help relieve their stress, and they could become addicted to those substances. And yet, they are in a situation where, yeah, they really need help, but then they also work in such situations where it's very stigmatizing. So, thinking about your subject population in that level of detail would help you design the details on and the logistics of how you would recruit them and what kind of things that they would be thinking about, and that would concern them. And this would help you also put in the information or include the information that would answer their questions without them having to even raise them. I mean, think about it like this. I think that as a clinician in the past, I find that working in cancer, that was my specialty too. People, you basically have to think about, okay, what might people be thinking about? What is the kind of information that they need? For example, it could be as simple as, okay, well, if they go for a cancer, treatment, have to receive chemotherapy over several weeks, they become very tired. They might worry about, okay, how am I going to look after my children? Where can I get support? Those things that from a scientific point of view might not really matter, but from participating in the study point of view, that becomes something that is really important. So those are the kind of, if you like, information that is totally, is going to totally, will be things that people are thinking about in the back of their mind when you are talking about certain things. So knowing your subjects, you can anticipate those kind of questions and provide that kind of information upfront. Now, avoiding coercion and undue influence. Misty already said that we'll be talking about this over and over again. I mean, coercion, she's already mentioned that usually it's a kind of situation where subjects might feel threatened, that they might lose certain benefits, right, that are due to them. A good example would be, if you have a study looking at behavioral intervention programs to empower women as victims of domestic abuse and substance use. So the prime time to actually recruit them and invite them to participate in a consent process for participation in research might be at the moment when these women were first admitted into a shelter, the time when they have really kind of make the decision to initiate some changes in their lives. So that might be the prime time to recruit them and to present them with the research and ask them to consent. But I think it would be important that as you do so, you clarify, what subjects will or will not get under different circumstances, making sure that they understand that their participation or not, their abilities to persist with their participation or not, will not affect whether they are or how long they will be allowed to stay in the shelter, right? So the two people, it's common. It's it's not. It's probably sort of common sense, if you like, that somebody's just been admitted to the shelter, just make that decision to come here and to change their lives, that that being the prime time to recruit them into this, they might associate the two together, that okay, in order for me to be able to continue to stay here, I might need to participate in this research, right? So you want to make it clear up front that one way or another, this is not going to affect it, right? That would be sort of really useful information to provide to avoid the consent process being done with, coercion that might not be intended at all. In fact, most of the time it's not really intended. The thing about undue influence, right? Misty has also mentioned that this is usually when your carrot is so attractive that people cannot ignore it, and that the enticement is so big that it would render them kind of if you like practically incapable of weighing the decision for doing something or not against potential risks of harm, right? I think that from IRB reviewers' perspective, often we've heard that IRBs tend to be fairly protective, right? And sometimes overly protective, especially when it comes to compensation. I think that for IRB reviews, if you are an IRB reviewer, I would suggest that you really kind of take into the circumstances of the research subjects that the investigator will be approaching, because every circumstance is going to be different, right? Be realistic, right, as to how you think about what might constitute undue influence. Not every $100 compensation, $500 compensation would constitute undue influence, right? From a researcher's point of view, since, you know, your perspective often would be from like how, you know, how I could actually recruit subjects as successfully and maybe even, if you like, as quickly as possible to the study, right? So your perspective might really be, okay, you know, not thinking so much about minimizing risk and be protective. I think that, you know, I think you need to balance that out by thinking a bit more in a more protective manner, if you see what I'm saying. So the perspectives are kind of different for the reviewers and the investigators. Like I said, consider the specific circumstances of your research subjects, where you're trying to recruit, who you're trying to recruit, what are their, you know, background circumstances, right? What might be considered as, you know, certain enticement that could be so overwhelming that, you know, could cause them to not think about the decision in a more realistic way. Now, people are allowed to, you know, ignore certain risks, and people are allowed to do very risky things, right? So, you know, we need to really think about, okay, what is being protective, what is being protective, and what is, you know, being overly protective. At the same time, I think that, you know, with the kind of research you guys do, we might also want to be careful that the design of the research is not such that it would contribute in any significant ways to perpetuating behaviors, certain behaviors that society in general might find objectionable or problematic. And I'm thinking that sometimes you might be designing a study where, you know, you have to, in trying to get people to withdraw from certain substance abused substances, you might actually have to, in the study, provide that substance to them in a way that, you know, if you're not careful with your design and how you think about it, that, you know, especially people from outside might think that, hey, you know, this is problematic. It seems like you're just perpetuating this behavior rather than trying to do something about it. So how do you actually do that? And you need to be very careful in how you present that study. It needs to be very careful, because you certainly don't want your prospective subjects to be having that kind of thoughts. You know, if I were in the study, I could continue to get this without having to, you know, do anything else. You know, why not? You know, so just be careful how you design your study and the kind of information that you provide to your subjects. And last but not least, I would say be very truthful and try not to misrepresent situations. So let's take a study that involves like truant use and substance abuse issues, right? It may be that by participating in a study that provides counseling on substance abuse could positively affect the relationship between these truant youths who've just been, you know, just gone through, you know, the family court or truancy court and been reprimanded, right? It might improve, it might come across, oh, well, if I participate in this research, or at least their parents might think, if I, you know, enroll my child to participate, it might create a positive relationship with this, you know, with the family court, and they might get something, you know, exceptional, good things out of it, right? But in fact, the likely truth is that, you know, okay, well, you know, they're going to get some counseling for their substance use while participating in this research. But in fact, they could also potentially get, you know, this counseling fairly easily outside of the research, right? And then as long as they participate in some kind of counseling program, whether it's within or outside the research, that they would be able to, you know, construct this kind of positive relationship. Or look good in front of, you know, the people in the family court, right? So just be careful about. I mean, it's certainly, you know, the fact that you're providing certain counseling to the youth, you know, if they participate, is certainly a good thing. But just be careful how you represent that good thing, and just be truthful and be realistic. So talk a little bit about privacy and confidentiality. Obviously, this is really, really important. And And again, I think that my advice is, think about the circumstances of your potential participants, right? And think about how they, how information might be shared, how much, whether what you actually collect for the purpose of the research, whether certain information might go back to their medical records, who is actually asking for the study to be conducted, and was it under the rubrics of just general health of my employees, right? And would finding out certain information about substance abuse could and how that information might be shared, or even if employers going to tell or you're going to tell them, tell people in the consent form that this information would absolutely not be shared with your employers. You might need to say a little bit more, right? I mean, I find myself, for example, this is the time of the year when we are all asked to do this federal employee viewpoint surveys, and we get being told over and over, this is anonymous. And I don't know. I mean, sometimes when you get these surveys, you kind of wonder, okay, is it really anonymous? And does it really affect when I say something? Will I get into trouble, right? So you really have to think about it from the perspective of the participants and provide that information that would either, hopefully, from your perspective, alleviate their concerns. And that would, by doing that, you not only provide a really good consent document or information for your consent process, but at the same time, you're able to assure your prospective participants, and hopefully that would bring them on board more readily. Mention about certificate of confidentiality, but also how you would actually protect the information that you collect. But again, be realistic, right? If you know that potentially the group that you're dealing with, and as you collect information from them, you might sort of accidentally or quite likely also come into information where there may be a requirement for reporting, right? By law. Right? For example, child abuse, that kind of situation, then you want to be clear as to, the extent to which, you could actually protect their confidentiality, and when it is that, under what circumstances that information that you would not have control over, you might need to divulge some information to some authorities, right? Just being very clear about that is going to be really helpful. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about this provision in the Common Rule, IRB waiver or alteration for informed consent. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the conditions under which you could actually request the IRB to waive or alter informed consent. Notice, one little I, two little I, 4 and 5 here. Those are the conditions that have been in the Common Rule all this time, right? They're in the old version of the Common Rule and in the new version of the Common Rule, and they haven't changed. In the new version of the Common Rule, there's this added, the 3 little I's here, this condition that needs to be satisfied as well. But I've graded out because, we're not really talking about secondary research here today. The focus is not on that. So I've graded out. It's not that it's not important. It's just that it's not really what we're talking about today. Notice that all these conditions need to be satisfied, right, in order for the IRB to be able to waive or alter informed consent. Now, with this in mind, I want to focus on 2 things that I want to bring out from this on this slide. One is to clarify that there is, so there is this waiver that and if the conditions, and if you manage to convince your IRB reviewers that all the conditions are satisfied, that the IRB could provide you with, perfectly legitimate under the regulations, waiving or altering. Let's just focus on waiving the consent, the informed consent, right? Now, as a legal requirement, as a regulatory requirement, right? Often this is confused with this idea called, we're going to get passive consent and provide, this option for opting out. There is not such a thing as passive consent in the regulations. What it often does mean is the situation where, in fact, at the back end, your IRB has accepted and agreed that the conditions for waiving the requirement for informed consent are satisfied, and they are able to waive that for that particular research. On the practical side, therefore, however, many times you would think, well, you know, especially when you're dealing with minors, right? Not sending the subject or not sending the parents any information, and then, you know, getting the minors to participate in certain procedures, even though the IRB accepted my, you know, request and, you know, my argument that it's really not, you know, it satisfies all the conditions here and it can be waived. You still feel uncomfortable about not giving any information and about perhaps not allowing the parents to say, nope, I'm just simply not letting my child do this, right? So those are two different things, right? So under the regulations, again, there's no such thing as a passive consent and opting out. It exists because, and assuming that that is the case, your IB had provided you with a waiver of consent. And this is just a practical part about, okay, well, just to make it easier and that people would not be upset, and you do that, just to make sure that, you know, parents will be happy and everybody will be happy, that kind of thing. And I'm sure it's doing something too, right? Because ethically speaking, you know, if you can engender trust, you know, in your research participants and the parents of your research participants, all the better, right? The other thing that I want to talk about, the other point I want to talk about this waiver is that do think about it as a flexibility. Use it as a flexibility if it's appropriate, when it's appropriate and applicable, right? To do minimal risk research with that involve minors, particularly in procedure, when it involves procedures for which consent is not usually required and without which the research might not be possible. And I'm sure that there are many, many situations in the kind of work that you do and the kind of studies that you want to be involved in that would be very helpful to know that there is this possibility, right? We talked about truant youths just now, right? Homeless youths who might be, you know, user of substances, right? And who might have other conditions, and that you want to study them. How are you going to be able to study these youths, right? So this may be a certain flexibility that you could, you know, use in order for your research to move forward. The next thing, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of regulation is this IRB waiver of documentation of informed consent. Essentially what it means that, you know, the IRB can waive, so it's not waiving the informed consent process as such, right? It's not saying that, oh, you don't need to ask for people's permission and you don't need to tell them anything about the study. No, it's not that. It's more like, okay, well, this provides a flexibility that you don't actually have to get them to sign the consent by. And what is the advantage of that, right? The obvious one is that when you ask people to sign something, right, it creates a record linking that subject to the research. And if this happens to be the principal risk of harm, right, breach of confidentiality being the principal risk of harm in this research, then, and I'm sure that you know, in, again, the kind of studies that, you know, NIDA does would probably, you know, there may be a lot of this kind of study. So, you know, if this condition is met, then why not utilize it? You know, ask for the waiver of documentation, and this provides another level of protection for your subjects. Other situations would be when, you know, the procedures are no more than minimal risk, and that they are procedures that normally under, you know, non-research situation, nobody really asks people for consent, right, in order to, you know, to do those procedures, right? If you have a research that fits well into this, right, condition, right, consider asking the IRB for the waiver. Now, I mean, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we want to talk about this because there was a question about, you know, that came into us, and it was about verbal consent, right? So this is, I think, what you guys were talking about, right? You know, that, in fact, there's no need to sign, right? There's no, and that there is, because this provision as it is written, I'm just going to give you the third condition where, you know, your research involves a cultural group where signing the forms is not a norm. So that's probably not so relevant to you guys, but it could also be relevant, right? So under, you know, if your IRB is able to apply this waiver of documentation, like I said, it doesn't mean that you don't need to tell people anything about the research, right? But it really does actually mean that, okay, you don't need them to sign a form, right? And what you actually tell them, right, can need not be in the form of like the consent document, if you like. IRB, in fact, might ask you to give them a written statement of some sort if, you know, if linking, you know, if giving people something physical to take away is not a problem. But I think this is, you know, notice also this waiver is different from the last waiver. In the last waiver, we talked about all the conditions needing to be satisfied in order for the waiver to be, in order for IRB to be able to give you that waiver. But in this one, any one of the three conditions here, if you're able to satisfy that, you could ask and request IRB for a waiver. And I think that this is what, you know, you guys would refer to as, you know, the idea of verbal consent. When is it possible to just ask for verbal consent? So with that, we finished the, you know, the serious stuff. And before we end this presentation, I'm just going to take you through and introduce you to some resources that OHRP has produced over the last 2.5 years, 3 years. So of course, our mission is to support the research community and, you know, to protect, to encourage people and to try, you know, to through our regulations to protect people in HHS supported research. We also see it as very, very important that we, you know, raise the knowledge and the understanding about research of the general public, right? So that the public kind of, in general, are aware and know about research, that research takes place and research is important, right? And so we've spent quite a bit of time in the Division of Education to produce resources that would help people understand various aspects of research so that, you know, not, you know, over time, right? And we hope that, you know, people know about these resources, they can access them, and before they even get approached to participate in research, that they could have some background information, right? That comes from an institution whose primary mission is to, you know, think about protecting human research subjects, right? So I would really encourage you to use our resources. We spend a lot of time thinking about the language, thinking about, you know, what to present. And this is where you can go to get it, www.hhs.gov/about-research-participation. And notice our resources are also in Spanish. We have videos, we have, you know, questions to ask list where people can look at online, or they can download a copy and take it with them when they are being approached for participation. These are our contacts and resources. We will be providing the slides as a PDF file for you. I want to point out this particular resource, the last bullet here. It is a mini tutorial. These are mini tutorials on prisoner research requirements that are on our website, and this is where you can go. So go to the OHRP website, go to education and outreach, online education, and you'll be able to find the mini tutorials. And they specifically, and they're like 15 minutes, like going through, you know, the essentials about understanding how to do research with prisoners. I also want to draw your attention to, again, this so-called Luminaries lecture series under the Education and Outreach webpage in OHRP. There is a presentation from Celia Fisher, who actually has a lot of experience doing research, the kind of research that you guys are interested in. You know, she talks about, you know, how to enroll vulnerable adolescents, right? Another luminary lecture series that may be of interest to you is the use of e-consent, right? You know, I know that you probably would do a lot of research online as well. So how do you do e-consent? We have, you know, specialists people who are interested in the topic, people who spend a lot of time thinking about that topic, talking about these. So these are resources that, you know, you're welcome to visit. And with that, I end my presentation. I hope that I haven't gone over time and that we still have plenty of time for you to ask questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Misty and Yvonne. That was a great presentation, and it took it from the gamut of some of the basics to the more focus topics towards our substance use disorder trials. I did want to mention that in the chat, we did get a comment when you were talking more about the ability to provide consent with substance use disorder. Frankie Kropp from our Ohio Valley node made the following comment with questions in it. So it said, regarding being competent to sign consent if positive for substances, what are OHRP's thoughts about participants with significant tolerance to their substance? For example, if you have someone who commonly uses illicit opioids, they may not be able to think clearly if they are opioid free due to withdrawal issues. Likewise, they may not be high even though there are opioids on board. Instead, they may be maintaining what for them is a normal level of functioning.
So, all right, this is Yvonne here. I'm just going to say it outright. As a physician in my past life, I've always had a problem. I think that what you guys are dealing with are just so interesting and complex, right? I mean, all the different types of substances that people may be using and how they interact and how they become tolerant and everything. I honestly have very, very little knowledge of that. So I'm not going to even attempt to answer that question in a way that probably would satisfy you. But again, coming back, I think that it is really important as experts in the area that you look into the details. So not everybody who's on a certain substance, would be completely incompetent, if you like. I mean, doesn't it depend on what you're asking them to make a decision on? What kind of information are you asking them to digest and to give you a response on, right? And what you just pointed out, right, you know that substance and people who have been using that substance for short period of time, long period of time, what their mental state are like. I mean, I'm sure you would agree that not everybody is the same, and you can't really across the board say, okay, well, if you're taking this much, then you're outright no way that you'd be competent for whatever, and then you're outright not competent. I think and I think that by doing that, you also kind of take away the opportunity to study some of these subjects who you really need to study, right? So at the end of the day, it is a balance. It is, providing your expertise, and it pays to actually, when you kind of going to, involve subjects in this, these kind of subjects in research such as this, you probably really want to pay a little bit more time in making a case as to why, you think that they, I guess, the fact that you want to enroll them, that you have to make a case to your IRB as to, why you think that they might have the competence in spite of that, in spite of how much they've been taking. And yet at the same time, you also want to convince your IRB, well, the kind of decisions that you're asking them to make, right, are not inappropriate, are not kind of decisions that, with this kind of level of, substance in their blood or, effect of the persisting effect that may be affecting them, that they cannot actually be considered competent. I mean, OHRP, and we have 20-something people in the office, right? There's no way that we can actually provide you with a direction for every single situation or combination. And that is a reason why having the responsibility of deciding how much protection and how whether protections are sufficient to go to IRB, a group of IRB reviewers, people who would at least people who would have experience and who would have understanding of this kind of research would be on those review boards to determine. Then it's in those situations, then it's up to you as researchers to be able to tell them, why you're convinced that, in spite of however much that this person is tolerant to and how much substance they've used, that they could still be competent in making a decision to participate in this particular task or this particular thing that you want them to do, or you want to recruit them to do. Misty, do you have anything to add to
I
that?
do, yeah, thanks. So I would add on from a practical point of view, and so this is one of those times when this is not going to be a regulatory answer. I'm going to give you an opinion answer here, but to give kind of a practical aspect to this answer, I think based on this question, what I glean from that is in some studies, and I think this is, of course, probably the case in some studies, if you are recruiting people at a time when they may be in withdrawal or may still have drugs in their system, you're going to have a full spectrum of who is more competent in which of those situations, because everyone is going to be a little bit different. I think probably the first obvious statement is, if you don't have to recruit them at that moment in time, then don't, right? But if the research intervention would need to be given when they are still in that state and in that period of time, then I would suggest thinking about it. And and as Yvonne was saying, giving your IRB all of this reasoning, right? Explain why you might do it this way, but because everybody is different and someone might be competent when they still basically are high, and someone else might not be, or someone might not be competent when they're in withdrawal, but someone might be. One practical way you can deal with that is to go ahead and go through the consent process and obtain their consent to participate in the research. Obviously, if they don't consent, they're not in, but if they agree to it, what you can do is you can record that agreement, and then I would say that might be a good time to go back some period of time later, when they're no longer in that state, and reconsent and find out if they are still willing to be in the study. And explain this as a two-tiered process to your IRB, so that yet you basically are seeking confirmation of that consent when their state of mind may have changed, so that you can confirm their true intent. And if perhaps you weren't able to assess their competence at the time. And so reconsenting could help you handle the ethical question of making sure that they truly want to be in the study. So again, that's not a regulatory answer, it's a practical answer to a valid ethical problem.
Yeah, and I guess, the other thing that comes to mind is getting a mental health professional, somebody who is, expert in, kind of testing and judging whether somebody has mental competence, to help you with identifying certain metrics that you could use, right? And so you could rely on the set of metrics to help you, right? To have some sort of more objective way of assessment, right? So that might be helpful as well. So, the other point, I just want to reiterate what Misty said. If you are able to not include those subjects and still be able to actually study that, whatever question that you want to study, then perhaps you shouldn't, right, include those subjects. But if your research question is such that you have to include some of these, subjects who might have these problems, then think about how you can minimize the problems, how you can provide the most protection, how you could actually still study, but still be respectful, including metrics that you could actually use to measure competence and the kind of level of competence that you want, right? Because if you ask them to participate in a drug trial where it involves a substance that is, so experimental and people know very little about it, could potentially, there could be potentially harms in it, then that's different to asking them to participate maybe in some sort of cognitive behavioral type of, intervention. And indeed, of course, if you're just asking them to, complete a questionnaire, right, which will, at the end of the day, only affect the validity of your answers, of the responses, not so much, whatever they do answering the question itself could put them into danger. So, I mean, there are all different levels and different types of research, different levels of, problems, and they all require sort of different levels of competence, right?
Yeah, thank you both. And Donna Brown Thompson kind of weighed in to agree that it is a potential case by case, where you have to assess, even if it were, let's say, a diabetic incident were occurring and you were trying to get their agreement or their informed consent into the study, that you would need to assess based on their condition at that time, whether that would be appropriate. I did want to also, while we're waiting for folks to chime in, I think that, Yvonne, the comment that you made about passive consent and how we need to ensure that we're not looking at that as something being covered by the regulations. Rather, either we're going to the IRB to make the argument that, yes, okay, this should be a waiver and we're requesting that of you. And then we're waiving that, but we're still giving something. But when it comes to research, we really want to think through the actual procedures that we're putting in place versus saying, oh, we'll just give them an opportunity to opt out. Because that's, you know, particularly when you have survey studies and those that, like you said, minimal risk, that there may be an inclination for researchers to maybe think in that way, but we don't want to think in that way. So I thought that was a really good point.
Well, you know, it is true that many of those, you know, maybe online survey, questionnaire type of studies that, you know, they're very minimal risk, or that they, you know, involve procedures that where consent are not normally required. And then at the same time that they might meet the conditions for waiver of informed consent, depending on, you know, whatever the conditions are. So, you know, you can use those two waivers together as well, but sometimes it's simply enough to just use one. Right, waiver of documentation may be sufficient for your purpose. But like I said, you know, just, you know, knowing what the waivers are help you to construct your request to your IRB and to make your case. But then there's, you know, it's true. I mean, under the regulations, there's no such thing as your passive consent. So by just saying, well, you're going to get passive consent, yeah, you just want to make sure that, you know, the baseline for the, you know, regulatory compliance is satisfied. And I really want to just emphasize also that, you know, the regulations actually don't ask a lot of you, right? You know, having said that, it's almost like, you know, with the kind of population, you know, that you are all interacting with, it almost calls on you to like think about them and think about what you can do in a empathetic manner and in a way that really, you know, respectful, because, you know, of where they come from. And I think, you know, that really is going to help with your research and, you know, and in helping you recruit in your recruitment and helping you keeping them in the study.
Great. I also thought it was a really good point about in the informed consent documents, when you do have written consent or you're providing information sheets, when you do have a waiver of documentation, what have you, to have the comparative data there so that the information that they need, very simply put, if I'm in the study, this is what I understand. If I'm not in the study, compared to that, I can, you know, the participant can easily see that. So I thought that was a good point too. I wanted to also mention that if you do have any questions, you can email me at twilliams@emmes.com. This recording will be available on the CTN Dissemination Library's website give me about 10 to 14 days to get it edited and to work with the librarians to get the materials posted there. So if you wanted to re-review or share with a colleague, that's open access to everyone. So please make a note of that, and then we'll get the message out to those who did participate via email that the information is available there. In closing, I'd like to thank Yvonne and Misty for joining us today. You did such an excellent job, and you covered, I think, the key focus areas for the substance use trials that we have when we're considering the design of studies and the design of how we disseminate the information to potential participants was excellent. So thank you so much for joining us today.
So on behalf of OHRP, we'd like to thank you all for, you know, attending this particular presentation and to really appreciate your invitation. And we have had a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Okay, and that will end our session today, everyone. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.